Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most transformative and frankly controversial periods in American history, the Age of Jackson. Picture this, the early 19th century. America is young, dynamic, and grappling with its identity. And striding onto this stage is a figure larger than life, Andrew Jackson. He was a war hero, a frontiersman, a man who saw himself as the champion of the ordinary citizen. But he was also a man whose actions would cast long, dark shadows over the nation's future. This era, known as Jacksonian Democracy, wasn't just about one man. It was a seismic shift in American politics and society. It was about the rise of the common man, the idea that you didn't need to be a wealthy, landed aristocrat from Virginia or Massachusetts to have a voice and hold power. Jackson's own story embodied this. He wasn't born into the elite. He was a scrappy, self-made man from the Tennessee frontier, and his supporters saw him as one of their own. This was a powerful new force in American politics. The very definition of the people was expanding, and with it, the right to vote. One of the most significant changes during this period was the expansion of suffrage. Before Jackson, voting was often restricted to white men who owned property. But state by state these requirements began to fall. The new ideal was universal white male suffrage. This was revolutionary. Suddenly, millions of farmers, laborers, and artisans, who were previously excluded, could now cast a ballot. This dramatically changed the political landscape. Elections became boisterous, popular affairs. Candidates had to appeal directly to the masses, not just to a small circle of elites. This shift empowered a new class of voters and helped propel Jackson, the people's champion, all the way to the White House in 1828. It was a victory not just for him, but for this new, broader vision of democracy. However, this expansion of democracy had its limits and its dark side. While more white men were gaining the right to vote, the same era saw those rights being stripped away from free black men in many states. And women, of course, were still completely excluded from the political process. This highlights a crucial contradiction of the age. Democracy for some was often built on the exclusion of others. And nowhere was this more brutally apparent than in the nation's policy towards Native Americans. Jackson, a veteran of wars against Native tribes, viewed them not as citizens of sovereign nations, but as obstacles to westward expansion and what he called civilization. This brings us to one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law, championed by Jackson, gave the federal government the power to force Native American nations, including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to designated territory west of the Mississippi River. The government promised this move would be voluntary and peaceful, but the reality was anything but. It was a policy of forced migration, driven by land hunger and racial prejudice. The tribes had lived on this land for generations. The Cherokee, for example, had their own written language, a constitution, and successful farms. They had assimilated in many ways, hoping to coexist. But it wasn't enough. The stories from this period are heartbreaking. We hear about the forced march under brutal conditions, with inadequate food, water, and shelter. Thousands of men, women, and children perished from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. This forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation is what became known as the Trail of Tears. 1/4 of their people died on that journey. It's a stark reminder that the expansion of the American Empire of Liberty came at an immeasurable human cost. It wasn't just a policy debate in Washington. It was a human tragedy on a massive scale, a betrayal of treaties, and a stain on the nation's conscience. At the same time Jackson was reshaping the nation's demographics, he was also facing a constitutional crisis that threatened to tear the country apart. This was the Nullification Crisis. It all started with a tariff tax on imported goods. In 1828, Congress passed a tariff that was very protective of northern industries, but drove up the cost of goods for Southerners. Southern states, particularly South Carolina, were furious. They called it the Tariff of Abominations. Their economy, based on agriculture and trade with Europe, was being hit hard. This economic dispute quickly escalated into a full-blown battle over states' rights. South Carolina, led by Jackson's own vice president, John C. Calhoun, put forward a radical idea, the doctrine of nullification. This doctrine claimed that a state had the right to nullify or declare void any federal law it deemed unconstitutional. In 1832, South Carolina took the ultimate step and declared the federal tariffs null and void within its borders, even threatening to secede from the Union if the government tried to collect the taxes by force. This was a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government and to President Jackson himself. Jackson, a Southerner and a supporter of states' rights in many respects, drew a firm line. He saw nullification as treason. He declared that the Union must be preserved and privately threatened to hang the nullifiers. He asked Congress for the authority to use military force to enforce the tariff in South Carolina. For a moment, the nation teetered on the brink of civil war. A compromise was eventually reached, lowering the tariff over time, and South Carolina backed down. But the crisis had exposed the deep, festering tensions between federal power and states' rights, and over the issue of slavery, which was intertwined with the South's economic anxieties. These tensions wouldn't be resolved. They would only grow, ultimately erupting into the Civil War a few decades later. So, how do we make sense of Andrew Jackson's legacy? It's a complex and deeply contradictory one. On one hand, he was the champion of the common man, the president who broke the mold of the elite founding fathers and ushered in an era of more popular, participatory democracy. He expanded voting rights for white men and fought against what he saw as the corrupting influence of powerful financial institutions like the Second Bank of the United States. He strengthened the power of the presidency and left an indelible mark on American politics, creating a style of populist leadership that we still see echoes of today. On the other hand, he was a president whose policies led to immense suffering and injustice. The Indian Removal Act stands as a profound moral failing, a brutal policy that resulted in the death and dispossession of thousands of Native Americans. His vision of democracy was explicitly limited by race. While he fought for the common man, this term clearly did not include Native Americans, African Americans, or women. He was a slave owner himself, and his actions often reinforced the institution of slavery. He was a man who championed liberty while denying it to so many. Ultimately, the age of Jackson forces us to confront the contradictions at the heart of America itself. It was an age of expanding freedom and brutal oppression, of democratic celebration and tragic injustice. Understanding Jackson and his time is crucial because these themes states' rights versus federal power, the meaning of citizenship, the tension between democratic ideals and racial inequality are not just relics of the past. They have continued to shape the American story right up to the present day. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Jacksonian democracy. It's a complicated piece of our history, but an essential one to understand. If you found this video interesting or learned something new, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Jackson's legacy do you find most significant? Let's discuss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.